the Danube Institute for an event we're hosting tonight with Dr. James Poulos. Melissa and John unfortunately couldn't be here, so you got me instead as the research director of the Institute. So Dr. Poulos is the online editor of American Mind, a journal of the Claremont Institute, which he's not only the editor of, I think he founded it as well. He's a graduate of Duke University, and he wrote his first book on de Tocqueville and the art of a free life. And this has been followed up now by his work, Human Forever, on the digital politics of spiritual war, which I had a while to get my head around, but I'm quite interested in the concept now. So as far as I can see, he explores how it is that we sort of made a god of technology, and the god of technology has made us its slave, or particularly America its slave. And one of the problems that creates, as James clearly identifies, is the role of what he calls the digital swarm, and how the no order that we live in, a kind of anarchy in the virtual space, has left us in the hands of the digital swarm. And I think what he's trying to identify is a kind of new politics that could obviate the role of the digital swarm, but I might be completely wrong. So I'll hand over to James to tell us more about whether it's human forever or inhuman forever.
First of all, the thank yous. Neither Melissa nor Rod are here to thank in person, so I'll have to thank them virtually and thank three very much alive Davids in their stead. I think above all, I want to thank the spirit of U.S.-Hungary friendship, actually. We have significant similarities as nations beyond what principles we share. A few demographic ones caught my eye. In addition to Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, there are even a few Orthodox Christians in Hungary, as in the U.S. Close readers of Human Forever may have noticed that I was moving in an Orthodox direction over the course of that book. I will go further in that direction today, but above all, as an American. So I'm here to talk about the book, Human Forever, in a way with what I hope is a special relevance to our shared struggle, Hungary and the U.S., with regard to the meaning or the identity of the West, with regard to the return of true difference on ultimate spiritual matters, and our struggle with the paradoxical power of technology. In short, with the digital politics of spiritual war, or the digital geopolitics of spiritual war. This being an international talk, I will try to give it an international flair in the closing, super controversial portion of my remarks. So let's begin with the paradoxical power of technology. It is true that the book begins with the following line: technology once made a god of America, now America is technology's slave. Now, the usual right-wing account of this process, it has to do with progressivism, has to do with scientism. The modern Enlightenment project is to blame for laying America low. Perhaps it's actually Renaissance Italian Hellenism, or French positivism, or British utilitarianism, or Prussian bureaucratism, or German Marxism, or perhaps even Hungarian Martianism, for those of you who remember the Martians Hungary sent over to the US to do all of this excellent, excellent military work on the bomb. Or perhaps it's the Jewish genius for entertainment, media, and narrative. So many potential scapegoats, so many people to blame, so many historical milestones. But why was the US so vulnerable to progressivism or scientism? Why was it such fertile soil? Well, there's some disagreement on the right when posed with this question. It's a little bit awkward for those who recognize America's exceptionalism. Perhaps in some way we're exceptionally bad. And so the usual right-of-center focus that attempts to account for this problem is, in some form or another, the old world invading the new, Europe somehow conquering America. Of course, I think this raises the question of whether, in fact, the old world just caught up to the new, that America tried to outrun the very deep and long history of the old world, and maybe the old world is beginning to nip at our heels. Well, Alexis de Tocqueville, who, yes, it's true, I wrote my first book about, saw the world getting more American. He saw what conditions obtained here would spread elsewhere, but in a perhaps more dangerous and chaotic way. That America was somehow providentially well-suited to democracy, to the forms that democracy takes, whereas outside of America, there might be quite a bit of pain, quite a bit of violence, as democracy, which he referred to as the equality of conditions, spread its way through the world. Well, what could be learned from the US before disaster struck, in Tocqueville's estimation? He said democracy brings new difficulties for rulers. Among those he counted envy. The equality of conditions causes everyone to look at his or her neighbor and say, well, I want that, or, well, that person's just like me, only a little bit better, and I want to be a little even more better than them. Insanity, he said that Americans continue to strive after their longings, after their desires, even after their reason gives way. He points to desperation, a very intense form of impatience. Americans know that the things of this world are fleeting. In democratic times, there's lots of competition, lots of churn, and so the things of this world are even more fleeting than perhaps they might otherwise be. No sooner do you grab hold of them than you feel like your life has been squandered trying to grab hold of them, and then you scramble for something that will be perhaps satisfying at that late date. Tocqueville warned of new objects of worship in democratic times. He singled out egalitarianism. He said, in democratic times, unity, the concept of unity, becomes an obsession. He pointed to individualism, to egotism, that people would become isolated in democratic life and fold up into their own inner brooding minds. He pointed to speed, to invention. He was flabbergasted when he spoke to an American sailor who bragged about his sailing vessel that could make it to the Orient and back in record time, but of course in 3 months he'd need a new one. He pointed to work, to the dollar, Americans scrambling for money in that way that I hinted at when talking about desperation. He also pointed to pantheism, to the idea of a perfected God that was the same thing as the universe, the ultimate God, the final God, the God that was unity of all things at all times to all people. And he pointed to the perfectibility of humanity itself, the way that Americans seemed to reason that it was only a matter of time before various improvements that were progressive and linear and cumulative to the human condition would eventually lead to the perfect regime, the perfect life, the perfect person. Well, that's all very interesting, and I think that holds up over time. But what about Christianity? Tocqueville suggested it was indeed very popular because so many Americans believed it to be popular. And so many Americans believed because it was so popular. But much changed in Tocqueville's time from that of the Puritans. He actually mocked the Puritans. He said they were fools for trying to make Deuteronomy the law, and they quickly found out how foolish it was and adapted to circumstances. He said they did learn quickly. He said Christianity was so well suited to the democratic age because it was very general in its religious precepts. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. He contrasted this to Islam. Perhaps that's a story for another day. And he suggested that Jesus Christ had to come down to earth to prove or to show what philosophy couldn't. He thought philosophers always disagreed, no matter how smart they were, perhaps especially if they were very intelligent, and that the inherent equality of all human beings was something that had to be received by revelation, we might say, instead of reason itself. But the ideal Christianity Tocqueville saw was unstable. He saw revivals, reawakenings, and radicalism. He saw a desperation for immediate spiritual experience. He saw that America functioned in a strange way as a sort of factory of cults. He saw the reduction of the Bible, the reduction of Christianity, to the Bible in Cartesian space, the Great Plains of America, this sort of blank map that became filled in with all these very orthogonal lines, a grid of streets. And then in the forests, where there were no streets, there was no grid, it was a person here or there, in a log cabin with a small shelf, and on that shelf, he said, were Shakespeare and the Bible. He saw the reduction of the church to the town hall. He was struck that since the Puritans, many of the churches in New England doubled as town halls, very plain inside, no adornments, no icons, no stained glass, nada. He saw the reduction of the priesthood to the preacher, whether in the cities or in the fields. And so Tocqueville saw lots of energy, lots of religious energy in America as America was growing, but more and stronger heresies. And we can count just a few in the years between the Puritans and Tocqueville himself. Universalism, Unitarianism, Utopianism, lots of U's. Mormonism, baptism, including race slavery as part of Christianity. It's almost fair to say that the churches of the time were heretical sects themselves just a few generations ago. Anglicanism, Episcopalianism, Presbyterianism. If you want to get a little spicier, Lutheranism, Reformed Calvinism. Even Catholics and Jews found themselves in a very different space-time in the New World. Something categorically unlike the Catholic and Jewish experience in the Old World. Well, I'm pretty sure there were maybe 3 or 4 Orthodox Christians in America at the time, but even if there had been more than that, I'm struck by the fact that theologically, the Orthodox might have not found themselves particularly out of place in America for the following reasons. They were unattached to Rome. They were unattached to Jerusalem. They had a conciliar ecclesiology, and all those things together made America perhaps especially seamless for the Orthodox to find their way in. And so, as I call it in the book, British Hebraic Protestantism, that is an Anglo kind of Protestant Christianity, deeply informed by Hebraic patterns of political theology. It ruled quite freely in the U.S., and it does so even now in some respects. The political model was Jerusalem, the city on the hill. The national model was the chosen people, or the promised land of Israel. The spiritual model was to propitiate the wrath of God by perfecting the law. And the juridical model was, as you can see in political theory, Hobbes, analogizing Leviathan to the Mosaic covenant, the overawing one above the many, and John Locke through Adam. So our right, natural right to property, could be traced directly back to God's grant of Adam's authority over the natural world. We had a civil religion as a result of all this, defined by Judeo-Christian values. David Galerner, who I'll mention a couple times in this talk, in some ways a very idiosyncratic fellow. In other ways, I think this is from his book, Americanism, the Fourth Great Western Religion. It's a very slim book, written somewhat around 15 years ago, I think maybe 2004 or 6, somewhere in there. Worth a read if you want an interesting peek at how a technologist thinks about these things. He said, Lincoln put Jesus right at the center of his spiritual life, yet he derived its substance from the Hebrew Bible. This is a pattern that we can see weaving through American political life. The New Testament, in short, was not the governance manual, not in the Anglophone West leading up to the founding of America, not in the Europe of the Wars of Reformation, and not in the United States of America, arguably to this very day. So it wasn't that the Old Testament was literally the governance model, but there were patterns of authority that had arisen from the Old Testament, which were found, let's say, more commodious than the quite radical, and in some ways not very political at all, models laid down by the New Testament. So what are these patterns? Well, books and writing as the technology of truth. Reading correctly becomes very important under those conditions. What does reading correctly require? Critical thinking, scholarly interpretation, therefore oftentimes esoteric writing, and ultimately a closed-door elite that knows how to discern and understand truth, and knows how to evolve along with truth. And here I go back to Galerner. He says, the Bible itself develops as a strange photographic negative mite from one state to another, endlessly onward as each generation applies its own characteristic developer. Our ancient forefathers were closer to God than we are, but after 3,000 years of mulling, we are closer to God's law and God's truth, which in any case must change as life changes. So says the technologist. In other words, Christianity was ultimately for the ruled, not for the rulers. And anyone who knows early modern political thought and all that led up to it is likely to recall along with me. It's fair to ask if even the Bible itself was the key book for elite authority in the West. After all, we'd tried Jesus. He was too hard to interpret, maybe too easy. We tried the Bible, but that was too hard to get interpretive consensus, especially after the printing press. And sure enough, wrath followed. Many years of war, many decades of war. I think Germany lost about a fifth or a fourth of its population over that period of time. What can we use as a stable foundation for our politics? Well, how about the Book of Nature? Francis Bacon, 1777. In his book, The New Atlantis, he has a sort of parable or a metaphor he refers to as Solomon's house. The end of that foundation, he writes, is the knowledge of causes and secret motions of things and the enlarging of the bounds of the human empire to effecting of all things possible. Very humble, very modest, Francis Bacon. Inspired the Royal Society, the French Academy. Royal Society's motto, for those playing along at home, is take nobody's word. So the Book of Nature became very important, and the thought that having failed to reach interpretive consensus on Jesus, on the New Testament, on the Bible, perhaps we could go to the Book of Nature, God's own creation. If we become masters of that, perhaps we can understand how to make perfect laws. And perhaps if we can make perfect laws, then we will finally propitiate the wrath of God. Perhaps we're now beginning to see how scientism is really spiritual. So, flashes of piety in America, but the Christianity of the U.S. regime itself, of the ruling class, steadily fades. The fruits and the trajectory of that fade were made clear, I think, by events. Manifest Destiny, the Indian, Mexican, and Spanish Wars, total civil war between two Christian sects, one very much anti-slavery, anti-polygamy, the other very much pro-slavery. Railroads, telegraph, mining, dynamite, the rifle, technological explosion, technology turned to violent purposes, to the use of weapons, to the creation of weapons. Later on, the impulse under Wilson to make the world safe for democracy. World War II with its unconditional surrender, with the atom bomb, the Manhattan Project, the Martians I had mentioned, mutually assured destruction, and now cyber war. As Benjamin Netanyahu likes to say, cyber power is real power. The result? America has been a spiritual breeding ground for progressive scientism, for the idea that ultimately the science of technology is what is going to propel our history, is going to drive our moral framework, is going to provide us the foundation for our politics, and ultimately the justification for our power. As I said in the book, I connected that up to those most apt to apply a mystical sense of destiny to the prospect of unrestricted technological development. In short, what I refer to in the book as the cyborg theocracy, which strikes many people as a mouthful, so I'll talk about it a little bit. It's the cyborg theocracy that has taken America from a democratic age god to a post-American age slave to technology. Sounds like a buzzword. It's really simple. A cyborg, of course, is a fusion of human and digital forms, and a theocracy is a fusion of spiritual and temporal power. So we've all seen it. This power has come out from cyberspace, out of the internet, to terraform us, our land, our buildings, our architecture, our art, our culture, ourselves, perhaps even our souls. It's a mission to replace by upgrading America. I don't need to recite the parade of horribles for you here, ranging from, if you spend $600, the government knows about it. If you say the wrong thing on social media, you are removed from social media. If you say something on social media that might contribute to offline harm, you will be canceled from the internet. Your bank account might be shut down. Your children will be encouraged to participate in bizarre cyborg rituals pertaining to their sex or gender. Many things. Ask the Biden administration. They know very well. They have a very clear idea of what they want to do with the internet. And what it is that they want to do is create a cyborg theocracy where our bodies and our souls merge with our technology, and they decide by what rules we will then live on and off the internet, using digital technology as the source of power that holds it all together. So in America, ostensibly, we rise up against things like that because theocracy bad. We're not supposed to be a theocracy. We have a First Amendment, so on and so forth. But one must admit there are strong temptations for Anglicans, Calvinists, evangelicals, Catholics, and civil religion Jews to actually maybe convince themselves that some kind or another of theocracy isn't so bad after all. Now, it's true that Christian nationalism, to throw out another buzzword, controversial word, is not inherently theocratic or even bigoted. Everyone from Yoram Hazony to Claremont Institute Chairman Tom Klingenstein has reflected on how it would actually be good if America was some kind or another of a Christian nation. But technology makes the theocratic temptation stronger for everyone. It's not just that liberalism failed or modernity sucks, it's that the digital medium is menacing liberalism, menacing modernity with a kind of obsolescence by undoing the authority of Judeo-Christian spirituality. Marshall McLuhan tells us that obsolescence doesn't mean something dies or it's eradicated from life. It's commodified. I think I can get away with characterizing him that way. And so when you look at the list of things that has provided that kind of intellectual and spiritual bulwark for Judeo-Christian values as the basis of our political life, you see a bunch of things that have really become tired or exhausted or overdone on the internet, things that are now a dime a dozen. Straussian esotericism, Kabbalist occultism, manifesto writers. Everyone has a manifesto now. Public intellectuals, critical thinkers, critical theorists, academic authorities, prediction specialists, trained researchers. Under the rule of technology, all these things, the value of them goes to zero. Why? Well, we know that our universities have already overproduced them. Now they're being automated. We don't need that elite. We don't need that knowledge working class. The technologists tell us that the computer will do it for us, that the AI will do it for us. Getting the data is now very easy, almost too easy. So easy that the big fear is that the data is going to go into the hands of the rubes, and the rubes will do things with it that you don't want them to do. Learning and extrapolating from data is growing radically easier. Prediction is growing radically easier, so much so that it's the new politics, or maybe it's even post-political altogether. So technology seems to aim to replace by upgrading Judeo-Christian values. The bots are the rabbis, the Borgs are the priests, the AI is the God, the lay people lie down, the farmers get farmed. Philosophy itself is no longer a stable middle ground, which in the United States has served quite well, political philosophy, as a stable middle ground for Jews and Christians to come together and work on prosperous, fruitful living. Well, tradition then is no longer adequately protective of the faithful. Civil religion is no longer adequately protective of Christians. We see this every day. Does anyone here really think that tradition, unaided, is capable of withstanding what technology is doing to all of us? Does anyone really believe that our civil religion, as useful and valuable as it has been in the past, has what it takes to stand up to this rolling technological revolution? So what this means is that America's dominant Christian sects, denominations up to this time, are in big trouble too. Now, differences in denominations often matter. It's often a matter of degrees of emphasis, and that's very important. But America's main denominations seem especially weak before the cyber theocracy. There's plain evidence in the decline in the number of Christians, in these terrible retention rates that so many Christian churches can claim. Of course, the rise in woke domination is a major signal here that something is awry. I suggest that if there's no tech, then there's no woke, and that if there's more tech, then there's more woke. Woke is really one more attempt to propitiate wrath by perfecting the law. They say, okay, we have these all-powerful machines. We just need the right kind of theology at the top, and then everything will be well. Purifying the law in order to purify hearts. But technology responds, well, sorry, we're always a step ahead. Anything woke can do, tech can do better. After all, when you look at something like the trans phenomenon, if there's no technology to make these changes, then you just can't have the identity. I like to joke that whereas people who insisted the future was female would say anything a boy can do, girls can do better. Well, today, anything a girl can do, a Borg can do better, a cyborg. And in fact, tomorrow, anything a cyborg can do, the Borg, the cyborg theocracy, can do best of all. This is what technology is selling us. Now, some evangelical denominations hope to do a bank shot. They say, well, how about this? How about only those with purified hearts can purify the law? Well, I would suggest that the George W. Bush administration provided that doesn't work so well. Just seize power as an answer to our current predicament seems wrong because the idea that we'll win if we can just purify the bots, the machines, our technology, is clearly wrong. That still sticks us with that legalistic framework. It still makes us a slave to tech. Tech simply becomes the new law, and then our obsession with perfecting that law leaves us right where we began at the beginning. Something wrong in our hearts, in our souls, and this desperation to make the law perfect so that we can all avoid pain and suffering. What tech offers us is merely simulating God, automating faith. Now, I know there are those on the right who like to say, well, if only we had our own AI, if only we had our own institutions, if only we just did everything the left did, but did it our way. I mean, Elon Musk is out there saying, I'm going to build truth AI. It's going to be just like the terrible AI, with the one difference that it's not going to be terrible. It's very tempting to say, well, we need based AI. We need red state AI. We need conservative AI. Well, I would suggest that that actually converges on Pharisee AI, an AI that allows you to stand before your techno-god and say, thank you, techno-god. I'm so glad that I am perfect in every way and I follow all of your laws exactly. And I just want to thank you for this blessing that you've given me. I'm so fortunate to be your worshiper who has already gotten everything right. And how sad it would be and how terrible it would be if I was one of those other people. But through your majesty, I'm not. I'm one of the special people. Jesus didn't like that very much, and I suggest that he wouldn't like it very much if we did it with an AI. I would suggest we shouldn't like it either. In order to catechize the machines, we must first catechize people. And if you want to know what we should catechize them into, I think you'll have to ask what kind of Christianity saves us from the temptations of this technology as it stands today. A few tips from Orthodoxy, humbly submitted. 1, there's no substitute for inner spiritual discipline over your passions and your senses. I know this is very hard for Americans. In America, you are supposed to follow your passion. If you can dream it, you can do it. You're supposed to trust your senses. You're supposed to maximize the information that your senses can absorb so that you make that soy face, as it's known on the internet, the look of all things coming into your senses at all times. That's bad. Don't do that. Tip 2, do not fear prayer, slowness, and silence. It is God who moves and manifests quickly. That desperation over having the boat that can beat the competition or the payoff for your years of hard work before your life slips away, don't do that. That's bad. Tip 3, Christ says, you know the commandments. He says, purify the heart. That is what completes and fulfills the law. This is the new covenant. Don't be obsessed with the law. It's already been laid down. It's quite simple. Focus on the heart. Tip 4, therefore, the New Jerusalem is not in any particular place other than in the heart, in the body of Christ, which is the church. That means worry less about geography, worry less about the symbolism of geography, worry less about the city on the hill, and more about the kingdom of heaven in your own hearts. I think this is tip 5 here. Theocracy might always be tempting, but it's broken. Strive for what's known as harmony or symphonia among the Orthodox. That's not church ruling state or state ruling church, but yes, the difficult relationship between the two, striving for a balance, for one informing the other. This is also very First Amendment, by the way. Separation of church and state with a wall of separation, that's dicta. That's a letter from Thomas Jefferson. That doesn't mean we don't want these things to be distinct. Of course they are. You can't have symphony, you can't have harmony unless the notes, the melodies are distinct. Okay, so those tips out of the way, and I'll close with just a few more thoughts here on geopolitics. What I'm offering is not simply quietism. I'm not offering a counsel of retreating to be ruled come what may. Yes, it's true that many of us today are very tired, very exhausted, want to end their bloodline, want to check out, want to be on permanent break, really feel like the rat race of this competitive American life is one of diminishing returns. People are going to want to retreat. They are going to want to leave this world. And what we have to offer them is something better than the suicide pod. What we have to offer them is something better than celebrate your obesity, disappear into a woke sinkhole of hedonism. What we need to offer them is a way to help in harmony with the reconstruction of our lives. I like to talk about that in terms of Bitcoin monasteries. It's confusing at first glance, but it's really quite simple when you think about it. It's really just a way for people who want to leave the world without ending their lives to gather together in the ascetic practice of using technology in a way that strengthens our humanity, that strengthens our way of life, that strengthens even our form of government. The job of monks and nuns is to pray for the world, and that's the kind of energy that ought to be going into determining the course of our technological development, rather than entrusting that decision to, let's say, people who make weapons for a living. We don't want to just do that, though. We have to be attuned to the geopolitical situation. It requires attention because it is also theological. Benjamin Netanyahu suggests there are 5 digital superpowers. I think he's correct. China, Russia, America, UK, and Israel. He once joked that Israel is not the 6th Five Eye, it is the 2nd. If you look at these digital superpowers, what you discover is they're all quite divided. China is divided between Taoists versus materialists. Russia is divided between cosmists, as they're known, sort of Gnostic techno-utopians, and several different kinds of Orthodox, all who are sort of divided amongst themselves in what's honestly quite tragic ways we see in Ukraine and elsewhere. America is clearly divided, and its European allies too, including many Catholics. The UK is divided. There are some good folks out there doing some hard work, but Britain is now dominated by a sort of wokeified Christianity on the one hand and a multi-ethnic Borg of tech worshippers on the other. And perhaps in some ways, most importantly of all, Israel is very divided. The devout have sort of noped out of the controversy. There is no, and this is just based on conversations I've had with very well-placed Jewish Americans who live in Israel. There's no sort of ultra-Orthodox political theory of technology. Even the more garden variety Orthodox don't have it. And so Israel is increasingly divided between superhumanists on the right and transhumanists on the left. This is a problem for America, and it's hard to talk about this because a lot's at stake. But if Israel is split between superhumanists and transhumanists as it attains a level of geopolitical importance, that complicates life for America as we try to figure out how to avoid either of those temptations and stick with something that works for what is still, beleaguered as it may be, a Christian nation of sorts. Israel is of necessity playing great power games with Russia and China and others. America is a classic declining empire. All rising powers want a peace. And so we have a bit of a nightmare scenario unfolding here. Nightmare scenario 1 is that America can't really be saved from woke by anyone but the technologists. That when forced to choose between woke and tech, we're going to have to choose tech. Nightmare scenario 2 is that the U.S. right actually can't save itself, and so the right might need great power support. But maybe there are no allies who are strong enough, and we'd have to turn to adversaries. Maybe we'd have to turn to non-state actors. For instance, state-sponsored criminal networks. Definitely a nightmare scenario. And nightmare scenario 3 is that even the enemies and the mafias that a really desperate American right might turn to could actually just laugh at us and say, oh, you should have thought about that in 1979. Enjoy watching your country now fall apart as ours once did. Well, I'll close with this. That's why the U.S.-Hungary relationship is so very important. We are without models. Not China, not Russia, not Israel, or even in some sense, the West, what that's now become. Just look at what's happened in the Anglosphere, look at what's happened with EU regulations. It's actually quite frightening and quite alien to, I think, where our hearts find themselves at home. It's all too difficult to rebut the claims from the likes of Putin and Dugin that the West has become satanic, putting the material over the spiritual. But of course, we can't leave the problem to those guys to fix. We need our own solutions. We can't ape them. We can't imitate them, even if we wanted to, which we don't. So it's daunting to face this paradox that the extensions of man, as McLuhan calls our communications media, actually threaten us mortally. If you look at the etymology of extension, you'll see that it comes from the words for stretch out. That makes sense enough. I was at Divine Liturgy yesterday, and Metropolitan Heraion called the faithful to a greater paradox, which is Christ's paradox. Who wants to save his life or his soul will lay it down, and he who wants to preserve his life will take up the cross. To become Christ's instrument in that way, to follow Christ, is more needful than ever. Understanding the etymology of instrument as a word that means to erect or to raise up, to pile up or build. Indeed, in the Orthodox liturgy, when the call goes to the congregation, orthi, it means get up, stand up, upright yourself. Do it now. It's something that you do in the present tense, that rebuilding, that standing up. That's what we need to do now. We need to focus on the present, and we need to focus on the ways in which we have no model anywhere else in the world, and that if we're going to save ourselves, we'd better look to ourselves and look within first. There's a parable of a monk who rebuked the devil's offer of power over the past, the power to change the past, by asking the Lord to free him from the temptation of what could be and what was not. That monk, so the story goes, said that Satan's goal was that we neglect the present, the only time God gives us, his grace, and the only time in which we can cooperate with him to fulfill his will. Said the monk, the past is left to the mercy of God and the future to his providence. Only the present is in our hands. I suggest we follow that advice, and I look forward to a nice convo. Thank you.
Well, I think this is working. Thank you very much for that, James. You gave us a lot to think about. And I wondered initially, so Thomas Hardy wrote a poem in the 1890s called God's Funeral. And one of the lines in it is, and who or what will fill his place? And you're arguing that that there could be some kind of Christian revival comeback to address what you identify in America as something like what Eric Voegelin called modernity without restraint. That modernity takes us on a path where, and particularly the West, which is so inventive and so radically disruptive, that it leaves us with a scientific achievement that seems ultimately without foundation, and we are in this foundationless space. But given the power of technology, why would it, and given the way in which the internet affects our, for instance, our brains and the whole structure of our understanding, that people who switch on to Facebook get a dopamine hit from likes, and dislikes make them unhappy. Where, in a sense, the internet is undermining our sense of an interior world anyway. The spiritual comeback seems, somewhat limited. I wondered if you had any views on that.
Well, it's, of course, a very good question. And if we give up now, we'll certainly have no hope of succeeding. But if you are convinced that reality is in fact not fundamentally material and is fundamentally spiritual, and that every instant of every moment of every hour of every day, the existence of all things is attributable only to God and to his creation. I think, the big bad boogeyman of technology doesn't seem quite so overawing after all. There's a temptation, even among critics of technology, to believe that technology is actually becoming an evil god. And I think certainly Christians, and probably others, have a duty to resist the temptation to believe that there could be such a thing as an evil god. Not even Satan himself is a god. And so to bring things back down to earth a little bit, if you log on every day with your senses and your passions organized in accordance with a belief that, well, the real God is justice, and the purpose of all life is to perfect justice. And what that means is the thing, perhaps the one thing that makes life worth living, is to perfect the law, to make sure that the laws that rule us are perfect. Then you are going to be held prisoner by the internet and by internet communications. I mean, we've all seen, you go on for 5 minutes and it's just people screaming at you because you are wrong on the internet. You are being unjust on the internet. This is what social credit is. This is what social justice is. It's a social credit machine. But if you log on, and of course, it's not, the internet is not just social media, and digital technology is not just the internet. I sold this book on Bitcoin. It's encrypted. It's published onto the blockchain. It's for sale in Bitcoin. No social media involved. Not much of the internet as we think of that involved. But thoroughgoingly digital technology. And I did so as an illustration of the fact that technology is developed to a point where ordinary people can use it to build institutions, to build markets, to exchange goods and services that strengthen us rather than weaken us. And so if you engage with fundamental digital technologies, with your passions and your senses in check, with your spiritual discernment firmly in place, and with an understanding that perfecting the law is not our prime directive, and that behind and below all laws are people, are men, human beings, hopefully mature ones. Behind the laws, behind the rules, are people's hearts. Then I do think, yes, it would be a much different cyberspace. Our approach to questions of weaponry, to questions of surveillance, to questions of secrecy, to questions of propaganda and manipulation, all of these things I think would change significantly.
Well, thank you. That was a very elegant answer. I've got a comeback, but I'll save it for later. David, do you want to say anything about?
Shall I?
Yeah.
Well, this is a very, very interesting presentation by James, and I personally got a lot out of it. What I do notice, though, and I'd like to call attention to it, is that it's very America-centered. Perhaps that's not surprising, but it raises some questions for me because I've spent my life dealing with Russia, the Soviet Union, world communism, and the history of the 20th century. So I have a mixed reaction when people talk about the destruction of Judeo-Christian values and attribute that to the internet. Because, in fact, the first country that was based explicitly on atheism was the Soviet Union, which was created exactly 100 years ago. And the other states that were founded on the basis of Marxist-Leninist ideology were similarly grounded in official atheism. And at one point, that comprised 1/3 of the population of the world. And it had innumerable sympathizers in the West and in those countries that weren't under the control of communism. Well, communism, as we know, absolutely denied the existence or the validity of Judeo-Christian values, universal values, replaced them with what was called class values. So, and the humanity emerged from that experience after the fall of communism with its moral framework, with its moral values severely weakened. And it's that weakened intellectual world which has now encountered the internet and digital technology. But the internet and digital technology are not the governing factor here. It's just that a pre-existing spiritual condition is very poorly adapted to handle that kind of powerful technology. So, as we know, all of the problems that we have in modern society become magnified with that kind of a tool. So I don't think it points to the idea that technology plays some sort of independent role, but rather that we are very poorly equipped to handle it. And with that, perhaps, James, you want to offer your, I don't want, rather than take time away from you, or from David, perhaps you want to react to that observation.
It's a good observation, I think.
Well, yes, you're quite right that we do need to give due attention to communism. I like to point out that for all the people who associate communism with Marx and with the Jews of Europe, in fact, it was Engels who played a large, if not larger, role in really proselytizing communism. And stop me if this sounds familiar. Itinerant cosmopolitan hipster boy with devout Protestant parents and a nice stipend sits at home writing fan fiction about how he's going to create the perfect society while his concerned parents ask him if he has a job yet and continue to send him money. So some of these things go back very far indeed. And it is, I think, it is interesting to recognize that in that sense, Marxism and communism sort of took a certain kind of Judeo-Christian ethic and ran with it in a very overly technologized direction. When you read Trotsky in Literature and Revolution, he's talking about how communism is going to create the Superman by reorganizing all of human life in service of technique. And what happened in the Cold War is in effect, I think the United States said, oh, you think that you have what it takes to create the true technological man. Well, we will show you what that really looks like. And America was able to spend money that it created out of thin air. And America was able to create wonder weapons using the money that it created out of thin air. And America was able to reorganize society and social values in accordance with that tremendous technological power in a way that ultimately the Soviets were just not able to manage. The new Soviet man turned out to be more American than Soviet. So technological that, in fact, you didn't even need communism. Communism became a hindrance to achieving that kind of truly technologized man. And some of this, there are these different communications media that come along and unfold over time. McLuhan's good on this stuff. And so at that time during the Cold War, the most powerful technology was the television, televisual technology, movies, television. And the United States was the indisputed master of that medium. What kind of values emerged from that technological experience and that mastery? Well, it was the ethic of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and Willy Wonka and Walt Disney. A world of pure imagination, Imagineering, industrial light and magic. DreamWorks, very, very simple. If you can dream it, you can do it. And whoever dreams the biggest and best dreams has the right to rule the world. That was the ethic that emerged from America's mastery of TV technology. And that was the ethic, I think, that the people who created digital technology in America expected to be consummated by their digital creations. Just look at what Steve Jobs was up to. But how did they make the shift from televisual to digital technology? Well, they took weapons and they turned them into entertainment. That was what really got Americans into the internet. David Goldman and others have been, I think, very good on this point, where even something like cable television was ultimately just kind of, commercialized repurposing of technological development that was begun by DARPA or by the DoD. You look at your phones, everything, touchscreen, GPS, all this stuff all came out of military and intelligence research and development. So I think the big question here is, do we have a hope of fundamentally altering the trajectory of technological development away from military and intelligence purposes and toward things that are good for ordinary American citizens? That to me is ultimately a spiritual matter. I do think that there is legislation that can be written and passed that will help. It will probably scare people. A Digital Rights Act where you say, you know what? The First and Second Amendment, it's already present there. We have freedom of association, and we have the right to keep and bear arms. Applied to technology, that means that everyone should have access to fundamental digital tools, high-powered GPUs, right to mine and use Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, things of that nature. And that spooks a lot of people. Oh, no, you get a bunch of people to say extreme things on the internet. Oh, offline harm. Oh, no, what if people are going to try to hack the government? What if they're going to try to do crimes? Well, yes, what if people live? There's always going to be a downside. There's always going to be a risk. But if we take all those tools away from Americans, look, Americans used to have a very confident and comfortable relationship with their technology. It was a country of rolling up your sleeves, tinkering around, getting under the hood, rolling under the car, making the ham radio work. Americans really drew a lot of their sense of competency and self-confidence from their ability to master their technologies by getting their hands on them, to learn through experience. That's starting to go away. Courtesy of these phones, most people's experience with technology is one of alienation, of envy, of only being able to poke at it like a hominid. It's really bad. And if that break is not mended, you can say goodbye to America. There's already no America on the internet. You see what the Biden administration is doing. You see the way that big tech has been complicit in it. A lot of these big tech companies are basically parts of the government, parts of the military-industrial complex anyway. And they just don't care if we are reduced to a level of servitude with regard to our own technology. If we're going to turn that around, I think, yes, we need to muster spiritual resources.
Okay. Talking about spiritual resources, we have David Dusenbury with the political judgment. I shall not judge.
No, I bring no spiritual resources this evening. No, I really hate to say this. This might get me in trouble, but I believe Marcuse was making this point in Eros and Civilization, right? I am no fan of Marcuse's writings, but he was saying that basically the point you just made, that consumer technology, 20th century consumer technology begins in the DoD, begins. He wasn't saying the CIA because I don't think it really existed or was very well known at that point. Can you confirm this? Have you looked at Eros and Civilization? Is that in any way in the background of your project, or because that is a kind of manual from the left, kind of Frankfurt School mid-20th century manual from the left for spiritual warfare. It seems to me.
Well, yes, it's all very interesting. Chris Rufo is probably the guy that you would want to talk about Marcuse more than myself, but I did read Chris's book. For those of you who have not, America's Cultural Revolution is the book. I'm now promoting someone else's book. That's some kind of no, I guess, but I'm doing it anyway to make a point, to make a larger point. it's called America's Cultural Revolution, but you open the book and you start reading it, and you discover that really the Cultural Revolution from the left that he's talking about was an intellectual revolution. It was a dictatorship of the intellectuals that was imposed on the people. And so the Cultural Revolution was an intellectual revolution perpetrated by intellectuals. And yes, the critiques coming out of the critical theorists directed at the conformism and the uniformity of industrial man. Yes, they were seeing some real things, and they were complaining about them. It always drives me a little bit nuts. I don't know how many, maybe this is the wrong venue, how many people here are familiar with, there's a meme where the rapper Drake is like 2 frames, and in the first frame, he's going, no, and then in the second frame, he's like, yes, that's good. And so my version of this meme, a lot of guys on the right who I know look at critical theory and they go, no, garlic, hold up the cross. But they say, down with critical theory, what we need is critical thinking. And I feel like, guys, this is kind of the same thing. And so in that sense, like, yes, don't, just because someone on the left said it in 1970 or whatever doesn't mean that you should break out the garlic. At the same time, none of these guys had any real idea about how to stop the train. Their argument was seize the locomotive. Well, okay, they did that, and now here we are going into the ravine. An abject lack of spiritual resources. And a belief that you really have to fight fire with fire, and if you seize power, that's the best you can do. I go back to Tocqueville. He talks about Latin America and how there seems to be this depressing cycle of revolution and counter-revolution in Latin America. Even though it's democratic, it's very unstable. And I think that following that path is going to lead to just to go around the world with the references, lead to what René Girard described, which is a continuous escalation toward apocalypse.
Since you've kindly talked about Chris Rufo's book, I want to bring it back to yours just really quickly. So I confess I only had time to read so far your first and last chapter.
That's all I read out of books anyway.
And so I kind of have 2 kind of big questions, maybe very simple questions, but the answer might well lie in the middle chapters. So the first is, I really liked in the opening pages of the book, you kind of in different ways and at different times asked the question, can we still bear to be human? Like there's a weight to humanity, something about virtual reality is an escape, or promises an escape, or convinces us it's an escape. So I really liked this motif, and I'm sure you develop it in the rest of the book. At the same time, I was struck because by the question, are we still human? Because you also say in 2007, quote, we all became cyborgs, like the phones you've been talking about. And you kind of mentioned this in your lecture this evening as well. So I suppose, and then in the very last pages of the book, you also refer to the fact that which we can talk about, the Bitcoin data centers are still a kind of point of meaning and the creation of meaning in what you call a thoroughly and recognizably human space-time. So you seem both to assert very strongly that we are still in touch with the thoroughly and recognizably human, and that we've lost it. And I'm curious about that.
Well, this is how you can tell that I'm not an East Coast Straussian, is the secret answer is not to be found in the middle page of the book. Little inside joke for the Straussians in the audience. Well, yes, I mean, it is later than we think, and that doesn't mean it's too late, but it does mean that that those who say, no, we don't have the luxury of stopping, we don't have the luxury of pausing, we don't have the luxury of sitting down with ourselves and creating even 5 minutes of silence to hear what can only be heard amid silence. We do have that luxury. In fact, we have the duty to do this. The propaganda, the relentless propaganda that we must keep moving as fast as we possibly can or we're going to fall behind. China will beat us. Our children will cease to be competitive. All these horrible things that we're told will happen if we don't slow down, they're all happening anyway. So perhaps we should slow down a little bit. And that doesn't mean, I mean, for heaven's sake, we locked down all of society and we brought everything to a halt for a year and a half or so. That was a certain kind of slowdown, and everyone came out of that feeling more exhausted, not less, because they spent all their time grinding through their phones. So, I'm talking about a real peace, a real silence. In that silence, with that peace, listening for what we can only hear when we have quieted our busily spinning minds, our calculating, imagining minds. What do we hear in that silence? What do we hear when we unclench and let go? Well, what we hear, I think, is, yes, we have gone very far down the road of technologization, and we have gone very far down the road of becoming cyborgs. But we can repent. We can have a change of heart, a metanoia. And that doesn't mean, getting out the flamethrowers and torching all of the machines. In the same way that we have electricity, we don't worship lamps. I don't know, maybe some people do at this point. But they're just, you plug them in and light comes out and electricity goes through the wires. In some ways, that's all that computers are. And for some reason, which maybe we would understand better if we spent some time in that silence, we seem to be convinced that we must whip ourselves ever onward toward turning these lamps into a god. Why? I think that if we give ourselves the opportunity to take seriously that a change of heart on these matters will allow us to find a path forward that does not involve abject slavery to this techno-god, but also does not involve bombing ourselves back to the Stone Age, as some of these, AI risk people want us to do. Call in the airstrikes. AI is going to destroy humanity. Well, I think of like John Lennon and Yoko Ono, like "War is over if you want it." It's like one of their hits that was maybe not as good as it could have been, but story for another day. Humanity is over if you want it. Yes, we can all put the gun to our heads and end it right now. We can build a monstrosity that eats us for breakfast, and that can be the end. But it doesn't have to be. Having a rediscovery of responsibility, even if you just look at, you can push etymology too far, but I like etymology. It shows you things that have been sort of concealed over time. The root word behind responsibility refers to the pouring out of libations in honor of that which you worship. That's what responsibility is. And rediscovering responsibility in that sense for the sake of preserving our souls, preserving the sacred gift of our bodies, preserving our relationship with our Lord and Creator. These things will, I think, have a profound effect on the way we see our relationship with our technology and allow us to master it in a way that is fruitful for us. There are always temptations. There are always risks. That's why we always have to be playing spiritual defense. Always be vigilant, always ready to just step on the head of that snake when it's trying to get in to the door.
Okay. Well, I wonder if we could open it up to the audience now. Have we any questions on our spiritual dilemma? One there.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I do have, I guess it's going to be a criticism, and maybe you can point out where it shouldn't be a criticism and I just misunderstood. But you keep saying
maybe you're right.
We have to look into our spiritual selves. We silence all of those things. I don't have any problem with technology as it pertains to my life, but I'm a professor and I see students incapable of reading. I see students incapable of even turning that off for a moment. I see younger people than college-age students doing it. I see that they have no spirituality, they have no spiritual maturity to bring to the table. I don't worry, quite frankly. I could care less what you do with technology and most of the people in this room, but I'm being sued by a student, because as dean, I said, yes, you're going to fail because you used ChatGPT to write your paper. Okay, and so he failed, and I wouldn't overturn it, and His argument is this is just a little bit further along the technological continuum. I use spell check. This is just like spell check. And the reason he's suing me is that the university at the time didn't even have a policy. So, but my point is, it's one thing to talk about a generation of people who might not have had a cell phone in their hands from the time they were 5 years old. It's another thing to talk about a whole generation of young people who've never been to church, who've never been exposed. In America, at least, you're not allowed to be exposed to religion anymore. The Supreme Court has made it very clear that something like that violates the First Amendment if you might actually have to hear a prayer being said in your presence. So we have this whole generation and future generations being raised by those generations that will have none of those things that you said could get us out of this spiritual problem. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to ask?
It does. Yes. Two things. The first is some of those people will find themselves in a very dark night of the soul one day, and they will realize that they have an emergency on their hands, and that if they do not have that change of heart, then they will die. Same as it ever was. You think about any all-consuming sin that can lead to the literal death of a person, whether it's prostitution or murder or whatever. And, few people wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to commit murder today. And yet you see them on the news and there they are. But in many cases, losing grace and falling into a life of true self-destruction unfolds over time, and there are many potential off-ramps that you have to ignore and pass by before it's well and truly too late. So I would expect that no small number of those kids of today will grow up to find themselves begging for mercy, and will recognize that they need to rip these real and figurative cables out of their bodies and out of their orifices in order to survive. We need to be there for them. Number two, at the same time, it is, from a secular standpoint, it is already too late for many millions of people. And how on earth we are going to govern these people is a very difficult question. It is very difficult. We are looking at a vast and growing number of Americans who are simply not able to perform the activities that without which it is hard to understand how to characterize people as Americans. It's frightening, and it is unprecedented. November of 2020, in an interview with the man in America who most wishes he was president, Jeffrey Goldberg, our current president, Barack Obama, said that the internet was the biggest threat to American democracy. He was not wrong. He was just not right in the way that he thought he was. Now, I don't think you have to be terribly conspiratorial to notice that, Tim Wu, a Democrat who's been in and out of the Biden administration, wrote a little book on this topic called The Curse of Bigness, and he pointed out that every single time one of the major tech companies wanted to acquire or purchase or merge with some competitor or smaller company, the Obama administration said yes. They rubber stamped everything. It was just cattle rustling, like, let's go, like everyone in. They built that big tech regime. And they built it very quickly. And to hear Barack Obama say that the internet is the greatest threat to American democracy, and then, since then, not leaving Washington, D.C., even after his daughters went to college, violating even his, norm upon norm was being violated here. The great respecter of norms. He's still there and people are still coming in and out of that house on Kalorama. And who's really running the show right now? And what show is that? Eric Schmidt is in and out of the White House telling the administration how to automate government, how to technologize government even more. You look at the way that they just want to lock it all down. Social media, finance. They want to create basically one app for everything and have the government be that app. Why am I going on this tirade? I'm going on this tirade because their plan is very clear. Their plan for how they're going to deal with this spiritually dispossessed population of 2 or 3 generations, depending on how they're counting. Their plan is very clear. Just kind of end, these people can't really function as Americans have since the beginning anymore. We're just going to end America as we've known it since the beginning. We're going to build a new thing on the internet, and we're going to onboard all of them into it, and we're going to take care of them because they need someone to take care of them. Well, it's an answer. I don't like it very much. Nobody in this room probably likes it very much. So if we're going to have a different answer, we got to figure out what that is and how to lay it out to people. It can't just be sort of humiliating them further. They're already at the depths of humiliation. But at the same time, it's not going to be like the New Deal days where it's like, don't worry, FDR is going to give you some soup now. That's not how it works right now. So it's going to be very difficult. But not to be a broken record, people are very spiritually thirsty. They've seen their churches fail, drape themselves with these, the current version of whatever rainbow flag has the correct number of stripes and vectors on it now. They've seen the hollowness. They've seen, scandals and mega preachers falling from grace because of sexual misconduct and so on and so forth. And they're looking for more, and they need more. And I think, some of what they need is going to come to them through the channels that they are the most familiar with and dependent on, which is technology. But if you give them the message that there is more and that they can reach out and touch it now, and that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, I think we could be surprised with how swift and how heartening are the results.
We've got a question here and one there, I think.
Thanks so much for your impressive lecture. My name is Alex. I'm a philosopher originally, was graduated from philosophy among others, and that's why I followed your lecture. I beg your pardon, I don't stand because I have some problems too. And about the 15th minutes, you mentioned Descartes in your text. Then I don't repeat all your lecture because all we have heard it. And my question and my interest deals with the sense of the spiritual and sense of the self, and sense of the intellectual, because the most of your lecture and roundtable concerned in the field of the philosophy, the field of the intellectual and intellectual sphere of the self. On the other hand, and that's why I mentioned Descartes. On the other hand, the spiritual seems to target the self itself. So my question is that how can you define the spiritual, and what relation can you see in these problems, spiritual and intellectual? And last but not least, can you agree? It is my impression that the spiritual war targets the self itself, as in the sense, but that's another problem, the sense of the self, but that would be matter of huge conferences in philosophy. So I'm finishing my question because according my experiences, philosophers are those people who never can finish their speech. So thanks so much, and thanks so much again, because I enjoyed your lecture as a philosopher, and that's why I have given these questions to you.
Thank you.
Well, God bless you and your unanswerable questions. So I gave a version of this talk in Miami. I think it was last week. It's all a bit of a blur. And that was focused a lot more on politics and on philosophy. I didn't spend a lot of time talking about the philosopher as philosopher. But if I did, I would have said, and I'll compress this, I would have said that digital technology, in addition to doing everything that I said it did tonight, it also threatens philosophy in a fundamental way. If you go back to Plato and Aristotle, politics and philosophy are in a tight relationship. The Greeks give us a picture of philosophy as being something which reveals itself most fully in the process of understanding the ways in which the city is like the man, or like the soul, or like the self, and vice versa. Technology throws all of that into doubt by proposing to replace politics and to replace humanity. What could be the role of the philosopher in such a world? Seems like not much of a role. Now you have to admit that for all of the good things that we could say about philosophy and about the philosopher, intellectual probity would demand that we admit, under questioning, that the philosopher is not necessarily any good for the city, or for the youth, or for the nation, or for the world, or for the human race. That is the fateful wager made by philosophy, that one must have the courage to go ever more deeply toward what seems to be the truth, until, as Nietzsche describes, you turn around and the coastline is gone, and then the horizon is gone, and then you're falling in all directions. And what if truth is something that is never going to be fully accessible to reason at all? This is the very scary wager that the philosopher must take, that the philosopher must place on the self. Do I, a self, have what it takes to withstand this journey into the abyss that philosophy is taking? Does philosophy demand of the philosopher that he in some sense become superhuman? These are all very interesting questions. But technology comes along and says, well, we don't need to really worry about that anymore, because the Borg is going to run the city now, and the Borg is going to sort of gobble up all the people and create this new life form. I think of Jeffrey Epstein's pet scientist, Martin Novak, who he called up to Harvard from the Institute for Advanced Study, which is in but not of Princeton, I guess you could say. And why did he bring Martin up there, who ended up being the professor who got him his key card and his phone line and his office at Harvard University? Well, what did Martin specialize in? He wrote a book. It's on Amazon. You can buy it. You can read it. Called Super Cooperators. And Martin's research was into how much we as human beings have to learn from bugs and viruses. We can learn about how to really coordinate social activity so that we can become a sort of swarm, if you will, right? So these claims that technology is trying to advance through the sheer power of its presence and its power and its effectiveness. These are questions that say, well, the self probably isn't really a thing. Consciousness isn't restricted to selves. You can have a collective consciousness. We'll build it for you, put the chip in your skull, plug each other into each other. This is the next
historical form of social organization. And so I think, I think philosophy is really in a moment of, perhaps arguably philosophy is always in a moment of crisis. Maybe that's what philosophy is. But philosophy has a gun to its head right now, and technology is holding that gun to its head. And I think it's going to be in a tight spot relative to what we might call spirituality. Because in the end, the spiritual is not simply about the self, although it is certainly about the fallen self and understanding how to see the fallen self as both subject and object, and to apply ascetic spiritual discipline to the recovery of the original created self from the fallen self. But in the end, that's not a question of just the self. That's a question of the relationship between the self and the creator, between us and God. And philosophy struggles to find a real equivalent to that relational underpinning of being. And I think that is a weakness that technologists are very eagerly exploiting right now.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, actually. One last question from the gentleman there.
Yes, I'm Tibor Lengyel, and I teach the global governance course at the Pazman Catholic University, not for the first time. I'm quite impressed by the overall comments, questions, and critiques, and also very much impressed by your answers in a multidisciplinary manner to those comments and questions. My question, if you want to call it like that, is you mentioned this superhumanism and transhumanism or extreme humanism in the Israeli context amongst intellectuals as sort of two extremes. Would you see any way out of that, being forced to choose between the two in the American context, back in your original framework, which is either might be too narrow? Would you see, just on the basis of federalism in the classic sense, meaning you mentioned the solution as harmony, even with the spiritual thrive on our part. Now, federalism is not the autonomous man's harmony conception, but I would submit to you that for the past 350 or so years, 400 nearly, it is for very spiritual people beyond the emanating principle of harmony searching, the structure. And if we could just move back to the structure, which is never harmonious totally. It comes from the word federal, feud. And we would look back to the Middle Ages. Some people would say very carried away, maybe that's the perfect age. Now we know that wasn't the perfect age, but maybe it was a harmonious, relatively speaking, age, yeah. And the American federalism, if we would take it seriously again, why wouldn't it be the solution? And Elon Musk, you mentioned Elon Musk and some of the others. In his understanding, why he leaves one club and maybe joins another club with his understanding of pluralism instead of an evolutionary moving towards something unknown, which is qualitatively superior to that what we have experienced so far. On the one hand, he's leaving that group and he's moving back. And the question is, what was the threshold, Elon, when you made that decision? He said, when evolutionary monism simply argued that what we had so far is not worth to defend legally as human rights.
Okay, well that's...
as human rights.
Okay.
So that's basically, is there a room for federalism? And can we protect it in that evolutionary monism that we are moving in?
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm tempted to just say yes and turn us loose, but I won't do that because that's anti-intellectual. Elon Musk gave some remarks at one of these globalist conferences not long ago, and the gist of his remarks were that that if it's very important to preserve the human race and prevent our extinction, then probably you wouldn't want to have just one human civilization, because the lesson of history is that civilizations rise and fall, and you can't ever really be entirely sure which one's going to fall next or whether it's going to be your own. And even if you assume that, well, I don't know, we've been going on for a while and maybe it'll be us next, it's hard to know exactly why, and it's hard to know how to pick up the pieces. And so if you have globalism and globalization, and you have one globalist civilization, you are really just tempting fate to come along and wreck your civilization, and then we have nothing. So we really need to hedge. So maybe globalization is not good after all, because you need to have multiple civilizations going in order to make sure that we're maximizing our chances of some form of humanity carrying on. We could spend a lot of time sort of haggling over whether that is like a kind of crackpot idea or there's something to it. But I think it gestures to what you're suggesting, which is that having that kind of laboratory of democracy, having that kind of federalist safety valve in American political life is important. And when you are talking about America, yes, there are these massive differences that have emerged, and red states and blue states are probably not going to just mush back together naturally into one thing anytime soon. But you're not dealing with like, well, we want to keep China going and we also want to keep America going, because if one of them sort of goes tits up, then, well, we still have human beings. America's not that divided, even to this day. And so federalism does seem like something that we could all live with, assuming that it was stable. And it's not clear right now how stable federalism can be. If you look at what the left is doing, especially just over the past 4 years, there is no interest in carrying on with federalism. And as far as how that plugs into the bigger picture, I'll just say one or two more sentences and then we'll be done. Michael Lind had a recent piece in Compact, and he said, in this century, the ultimate struggle will be between the religious and secular heirs of the Abrahamic tradition of ethical monotheism on one side, and the believers in eugenics, transhumanism, and other pseudoscientific new faiths on the other. Now, with all due respect to Michael Lind, he's a smart guy. I just don't know where these secular heirs of the Abrahamic tradition are who are going to stand strong against transhumanism or against superhumanism. I just don't see them. And so for all that federalism can do to help us, if we carry on with this naive idea that sort of secular civil religionists are going to be able to muster strong arguments that will beat back transhumanism or superhumanism, I just think that we're in for a lot of pain, and that it's going to end in tears. So 2 cheers for federalism.
Okay, well, I think time has pushed us to the limit here. I know the recording people want to go home. So despite that, it was a great talk, and I think we learned a lot about the miserable condition we're currently in and some potential way out, but we haven't got a lot of hope, but there's some. On that note,